Hello, good evening, everyone. Welcome. I'd like to introduce myself before we get started. My name is Lydia. I'm the Human Development Director at O20, and I'd like to just give you a brief introduction about who we are and what we stand for. So O20 is a political party that utilizes progressive pragmatism to achieve our goals. And of these aims, we value increasing diversity, helping students with housing, and connecting our peers with job and opportunities. So we don't only focus on matters directly related to university, but also on matters that improve our students' prospects after finishing their studies and moving on to their professional careers. If you're interested in joining us, we are always on the lookout for anyone to join as a member. If this sounds like something for you, please don't hesitate to get in touch with me or contact us at hd@o20together.nl. And on behalf of everyone at O20, we sincerely hope you enjoy this evening. Sorry, Kara, back to you. You can take it away.
Okay, thanks. I didn't know. Hi, everyone. I'm Kara. I'm a third year of European Studies, and in my second year, I chose to do the European History major. I'm guessing you're either in your first or second year of European Studies and thinking about if you want to maybe take a second major or take your first major. And yeah, I just want to introduce the history major for you from my perspective, my personal experience. Yeah, and I hope that's interesting to you. Wait, I can present it a little bit nicer. There we go. Yeah, about myself, I'm German. When I was 15, I moved from this little village over here, Hameln, to and then when I was 17, actually, I attended an open day. Oh, it says my internet connection is not stable. If you can't hear me, please let me know. Yeah, so I attended an open day at the UVA. And I remember it was 2015-16 when the refugee crisis was at its height. And the lecture was introduced in European studies as a way to sort of tackle issues like this in the context of the European Union. And also they said, oh, you can also study a language. And I thought that's great. And then I can also continue my French, which I started in high school. And then with 16, I decided I'm going to study European studies. I'm going to live in Amsterdam, and that's sort of yeah, how it came to be. So I finished my first year, and then when I had to choose my major, there were a couple of questions which I asked myself. And I tried to sort of emphasize my thought process below. But there are a couple of questions which you can ask yourself, basically. One of them was, you can see, okay, which courses was I good at in my first year? I personally was really, really bad at economics, and I was really bad at law as well. So the courses that were left over for me was culture, history, and Eastern Europe. And I was personally most interested in Eastern European history and history. So the next step was to sort of look at, okay, what mandatory courses can I take in Eastern European perspective or Central Eastern European perspective, post-Soviet perspective. So I would recommend to you look at the course catalog, read what these courses have to offer. And my electives, actually, they really influenced my course choices later on, but unfortunately for you, they're not on offer anymore for the year 2021-2022. But one of the courses I took was called Race, Rights and Humanity in European History, taught by the wonderful Boyd van Dijk, who has left our university. And then one was called Imagine Europe at the End of the Cold War, Visions, Concepts and Afterlives, which was a really great course. But yeah, because these are not on offer anymore, I thought I would give you a quick overview of the courses which you can choose for the next year. Some of them overlap with other major Modern Europe on realities and representations. This one is also offered in the European culture major, for instance. So it's nice to see these overlaps. Legacies of the Enlightenment, if you thought, okay, I really like Turning Point, so that might be interesting for you. Soft Power, Russia's Cultural Politics in the Near Abroad, also shared with the Eastern European one. Unequal Europe, Socioeconomic, Spatial Justice across European cities and regions. I had a couple of friends which took this course and really enjoyed it. Contemporary Metropolis in the Eastern Mediterranean, European Memory and Heritage, and then a Dutch one, which I don't want to pronounce. So the impact this had on my third year. So for me, I will probably not go on to study a history master, but I still really learned a lot in the history major. What I found for myself was that I'm really interested in the history of ideologies. So for instance, racism, the history of racism, the history of colonialism, the history of sexism specifically. I decided instead of going abroad, which was cancelled because of Corona. And these were very influenced by my interests of the history of human rights. Remember, I took a course, Race, Rights and Humanity in European History. And also the history of international relations. We learned a lot about the League of Nations in the courses I took. And this would be the focus for my thesis, actually. So even though you don't want to maybe necessarily study history afterwards or want to become a historian or academic, there's a lot of things you can take from the bits that you learn. Some thesis topics, especially in your second year, it's important to think about, even though quite frankly, most people only start thinking about it in the second semester of their third year. Like myself, it took me a while to find my topic, but I'm personally going to write about the construction of women as a subject of international law. So I'm going to look at the first treaties, which were drafted in the interwar years by the League of Nations, which looked at the traffic of women and children as a global criminal problem. It's still very broad, but I get to it. Then a former student of mine, Niels, he wrote a really good thesis about colonialism without colonies in the Weimar Republic. For that, he consulted different colonial imagery, because Germany is not very known for their colonial history, but he still sort of pieced it together. And it's a brilliant thesis, I've read it. And then Louise, another friend of mine, she is going to write about the lived experience of Black American actors in the Soviet Union. So specifically, she's going to look at a group of African Americans who during the Cold War went to the Soviet Union to shoot an anti-American propaganda film, and about their personal experiences. So very, history, and we all took the same courses actually, and we all have different takeaways, and this is sort of the end result of our European history education. So it's very broad. Assessment and grading. If you choose European history, there will be a lot of essays to write. So most of them are between 2,000 and 2,500 words. And I'd say on average, you write about 1 to 2 per course. But it's very nice because usually you can choose the topic yourself. It's very rare that the topic is given to you. So yeah, I think it's absolutely doable. But if you, if you don't like to write essays that much, then maybe it's something to think about. Skills which you would maybe not necessarily relate to the study of history, but which I have personally learned. I've learned to write very effectively, I think. I remember in the very beginning, it took me about a week to write a 2,000 or 2,500 word essay. I think now it takes me about 2, 3, 4 days maximum, because you learn to filter the sources which you want to use. You learn to look at the footnotes. You learn to look at, you learn to recognize important authors in the field. So for me, I've written a lot about European colonialism, and I've written a lot about women's studies. And at some point you manage to come back to the same authors. You sort of, yeah, you just sort of get better at evaluating sources and integrating them into your writing. And a surprising skill, which I've learned, which I didn't expect, is to consult archives. So in 2 different history courses, I've been to different archives. Also for my thesis, if they open in time, which I really hope they do, I will be going to the Peace Palace Library in The Hague. And it's very exciting because it's almost like detective work. You get to look at the different primary sources, and you can make your own conclusions from the knowledge that you have gathered over the last year or 2 years. Another thing is that you learn to evaluate current day issues from a historical perspective. So when people choose history, a lot of times it's interesting, but I think it really it really helps you to understand the world, how there is current conflicts that are going on. Why the European Union decides the way they do in terms of economy, for instance. We've learned this in European integration. So I find this personally very important, also just as general knowledge. It's a good basis for a solid education, I'd say. And then lastly, I think the study of history really made me think critically, because you think about, okay, whose history are we telling? Because history is a narrative in the end. Whose history are we silencing? So whose history are we not telling? And which histories still have to be told? So we always I think about history of being something of the past, but there's still so many stories which need to be told and which have been traditionally neglected. If you think of Louise's thesis, she's writing about Black lived experiences, which have not traditionally been the focus of history telling. And I have a statistic in mind, which I really hope it's wrong, but it says that only 0.5% of all history has been written on women, for instance. So yeah, there's still a lot to discover if you find sort of your niche. Future outlook. So I've done my European history major. I've done 2 minors. I've done a second European culture major. So I hope at the end of this year, I will successfully complete my thesis. We will see about this. Then I am going on to a 4th year because I wanted to go abroad initially this year, but I have moved my Erasmus to the 2nd semester of next year. So we will hope this is going through. And then I consider a master in the fields of maybe international relations, journalism, politics. You might notice from these master perspectives, none of them are in the humanities. I know it's really hard to think really far in the future, but when you choose your majors and minors and all of the extra courses you want to do, think about maybe which sort of credits you need to get into, for instance, social science masters or other directions which you might consider. That's my presentation. Thank you. Oh yeah, if you have any questions. Sorry, I forgot that part. Please let me know if you want to know about, European history or about my personal experience as a student, or if you have any specific content questions. Feel free to ask them, please. Madeline asks, is there something you regret about choosing European history? No, actually, I really enjoyed European history. It's also, if you consider the other options, I just knew for myself that for me it was the best option. I already liked history, I liked writing, which I think is also important. I wish I would have chosen Eastern European history as my second major, for sure, because I think it's very interesting. And I chose culture because it was the very beginning of COVID and it was all online education. And I thought, oh, I want something that is easy, which is a silly way to think. But yeah, I personally really, really enjoyed the European history major. Joanna asked, what masters are you considering? Very different masters. I think I will hopefully go in the direction of international relations, but it's not quite sure yet. But with a history major, it's a Bachelor of Arts, you can go into a variety of directions. There are also specific European history masters. Amos asks, would you consider the history mostly modern, or is there also options for the Middle Ages and antiquity, etc.? No, it's mostly modern history, at least the courses I took, maybe in the electives. There are different orientations, but in the first year in Turning Points, if you remember, you looked at the Enlightenment and you looked from the very fall of, I think, Rome, was it? Into the present. But no, also the ordering of Europe, it's the 20th and the 21st century. And then technically you could probably write your essay in any time period you're interested in though. What about tutors and lecturers? Anyone we should watch out for? I mean, we have really great teaching staff in the European Studies department as a whole. I think as a student in general, it is worth reaching out to your professors. I know it's really easy to fall into passivity if you are a student. But I mean, I think they have so much to offer and everyone is really helpful. So for instance, I applied to internships and then sometimes you need recommendation letters. And then of course, if your professors know you already really well and they know who you are and they know the essays you write and the topics you're interested in, then they can actually write good recommendation letters for you. So you probably know, for instance, Hugh Blairson, he's like a rock star in the European Studies department. Nevenka Trump is an amazing teacher. She works in the Eastern European Studies department. Robin de Bruin, of course, he is here as well. Also an amazing teacher. I don't know if you do it this year, Robin, but he taught our course 20th, 21st century history the year I took it. Yeah, Larson Scott, yeah, he's an amazing teacher for sure. So yeah, I don't know, don't be afraid to reach out. But I didn't like all of my teachers, of course. That's, I think, just really natural. Were the assignments mostly essays? Was there anything else? I remember mostly essays. I think, of course, you have a presentation. I had to write a literature review in my race, rights and humanity in European history course, which was very interesting. Also, I remember in one course you had to read texts and then you had to like answer some questions which count into your participation grade. But yeah, it is mostly essay writing, but I think it's not necessarily only European history thing. I think it's a humanities thing in general that you have to write a lot of essays. Anything we should look out for? Well, what do you mean specifically about the assignments or in general? To look out for sounds like something really scary. No, it's not that scary. I think it was I know, for instance, a lot of students really struggled with the economics major because there were a lot of assignments. In that sense, I don't think I was ever enormously stressed in the history major. I really found the learning quite enjoyable. But this might also be because I'm prone to read a lot of texts and to process them and to process them into essays. When choosing a major, to what extent does it narrow down your options for master's degrees? It depends. If you want to do law, then so a law master, I think they're called LLM, then you really need to get the credits. I think people who do law, they take extra law masters. So I would recommend, depending if you say, okay, I want to study European law afterwards, then go to a law teacher. Speaking of really great teachers, Paula is a really great teacher in the European law department. And ask them which courses you have to take. Go to the study advisor, they're really helpful. I had a friend, for instance, who really wanted to study a master, who was a social science master, I think international relations, maybe, something like it. And then she got told by someone from the wrong faculty that she has to take research credits. And then she actually didn't apply for the deadline, which was quite early for people already enrolled at the UVA in March. And now she actually didn't do it because she got told the wrong information. So really inform yourself. You need to take certain courses in order to study certain masters, which is also why I took 2 minors in the social science department in order for me to have over 60 credits in social science, basically. But I also know it's really hard to think this far ahead. I didn't get this far until the very end, which is also why I'm taking a 4th year. Robin De Bruin, he says, hi Cara, thanks for your excellent presentation. Next year, a new elective will be added to the European history program called Europe and the Global South in the 19th and 20th century. Oh yeah, that probably really would have been interesting to me. It's not in the course catalog yet, I think, even though they said it would be updated, but it's definitely good to look out for. Usually things change later on. And I think you only have to choose your courses, I think, in June or July. Anyway. Did you conclude your 2 minors in 1 semester? No, no. I did. For me, I struggle with stress and anxiety when it comes to studying. So at one point, I think I took 3 courses at the same time, and it was a lot. So I couldn't really do it. So I started my gender and sexuality minor at the beginning of the 1st semester in my 3rd year, because it was a last minute decision because of COVID, because I thought I'd be going to France. And then I looked at all the minors and I found this one really, really interesting. So I decided I would do this. And then I had an amazing teacher who taught feminist theory in the end of December. And then I decided, oh, I really like this teacher. And she does the political theory one. So I entered the 2nd minor irregularly in the 2nd semester. And then now I will finish both of them in the 1st semester of my 4th year. But luckily, I already wanted to take a 4th year either way, even though I understand a lot of people don't want to do it. How does the 4th year work? Is it an option for all of us? Yeah, you can take a 4th year. You just stay enrolled in the course, basically. I mean, you have to do something. I'm not quite sure how this works if you would just take a 4th year and not select any courses. But if you you don't get your diploma. I will still write my thesis this year, so I'm in the process of writing my thesis right now. But for instance, I'm also missing 6 credits, so I could not just complete the year. So I would have to still do 6 credits in the next year. Yeah, and you can do an internship or you can go abroad, but also then I would advise you to talk to your study advisor to explore all the options you have. Okay, if there are not any more questions, then I would suggest we take a little break, and then, oh wait, one more. Do you have, is this major compared to the others? Oh, how intense is the major compared to the others? I wouldn't, well, I've only taken history and then culture. I thought both of them were sort of equal in terms of the amount of work that you have to do. I think it really depends also what you're good at, to be honest, because for instance, I have the thing with numbers, like I can't do math. So for me, economics would have been terrible probably. But I think if you're interested in something and if you're passionate, then I think they are absolutely doable. So don't worry about this. Okay, guys, if there are not any more questions, you can also still text me in the chat, that's no worries. But then we will take a 5-minute break so we can drink, and then Federico Romero is gonna join, who is, I will have an interview with him. And he is he's a professor at the European University Institute, and he has made a career out of European history and especially studying European integration. So yeah, see you in 4 minutes. Hello, Mr. Romero. Thanks for joining us.
Hello, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, I can hear you very well.
Thank you. I'm Kara, by the way. I will be your interviewer.
Thank you.
We said we will take a break until 35. So then we will proceed with the interview.
Sure, okay. No, that's fine with me.
Perfect, thank you.
I have the list of topics that was sent to me, so I'm prepared.
You're prepared, great. Well, I wrote the questions.
Oh, good.
So
until when do we go on?
It's about 18:30, but yeah, we will see. I think
Okay.
I mean there will be.
Okay.
I just got private instructions, 30 to 40 minutes, and then we have questions afterwards.
Okay, no, that's fine. No problem.
1 minute, then we will proceed.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I would suggest we will proceed. Mr. Romero, would you like me to introduce you, or would you like to introduce yourself?
Introducing myself is fairly simple. I think I'm a scholar of history. I've been an historian since the sort of beginning of my career in the late 70s, early 80s, working mostly on 20th century international history, European, American, transatlantic. And I'm now approaching the end of my career and retirement in a couple of years. So
in a couple of years, well,
in a nutshell, that's my story. Yeah,
that's your story. Well,
yeah.
You said it very simply and very humbly. I think there might be a bit more to it. But either way, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
I would quickly introduce myself. I'm Kara. I study European Studies at the University of Amsterdam. I'm in my third year now, and I chose to do European history as a major. So we have 5 specialization courses: economics, law, culture, Eastern Europe, and history. And I chose history, which is why I was kindly invited by Project Major to represent the major. And we thought we would invite a career historian who can actually tell us all the future possibilities, or one of the future possibilities
Sure.
that we have, basically. So if you're comfortable with this, I would first like to question you broadly on your study experience, because I think this is especially interesting for the audience, who are mostly students, I think first year, second year European Studies. And then a bit more about your work at the European University Institute and about your research specifically. If you're on board of that, I would first like to ask you, what is your current occupation? How would you describe your current occupation?
Well, the title formally is Professor of Post-War European Integration and Cooperation at EY, which is a chair that has been there from the beginning of the European University Institute, that was focused particularly on the history of European integration, something that when the EUI was funded in the 70s was almost non-existent. And actually this chair got the history of European integration for the first time on the map with some very eminent scholars at the beginning, Walter Lipkens and then Alan Milward, that de facto shaped this nascent field. Then the department, of course, evolved over the decades, but the chair more or less remained, even though it was expanded from European integration, sort of stricto sensu, to a broader focus on various forms of European cooperation, as well as of international projection of European institution, and therefore this type of chair. Okay. What do I do? 80% to what we do at European University Institutes is supervise doctoral projects. The EUI has only doctoral degrees, even though we're introducing some master degrees, but these are fairly new. But by and large is a doctoral program articulated in history, political science, sociology, law, and economics. So what we do, each one of us, is supervise a fairly large amount of PhD students who have a 4-year grant to pursue their own specific projects. On top of that, of course, we do our own research, or we run research groups or working groups that often enough include the PhD students themselves and some postdocs, because we also have a very large postdoc program called the Max Weber program. So we have doctoral students and postdocs for 2 years. And then some of us, of course, have administrative duties every now and then, head of department, in my case at the moment, dean of research. But the vast and central work that we do is supervising doctoral students and doctoral projects.
Okay. And how long have you been in this position for?
I got this position in 2010. The standard contract at UI is 8 years, so the professors sort of rotate on a constant basis. Then again, if you serve as head of department or dean, you get an extension, which in my case will extend to 12 years instead of 8, but the average professor at UI stays for 8 years.
Oh, okay. Rolling all the way back. So now you are the dean of a prestigious university in European history. But what did you study? What and where did you study? Your bachelor, I guess.
Yeah, I studied what at the time was a 4-year degree in humanities.
Okay.
At the University of Torino in Italy. This is in the mid-70s. And a 4 years degree in humanities meant that you did a mix of history, philosophy, literature, bit of anthropology if you wanted to. It was just beginning to include semiotics, what eventually would become cultural studies. But at the time, they were still fairly traditional disciplines, which I chose humanities by exclusion, as almost all of us do. I was fairly poor in math.
Yeah.
I couldn't consider medicine, biology, because I still am very squeamish about blood and things like that. And humanities seems a good, interesting choice. I was interested in understanding the transformations of the society I was living in. So humanities, was sort of natural to me. Then within humanities, I had really no idea which way I would specialize, but by taking exams here and there, I found out that history was the most interesting to me. Philosophy was a bit too abstract. Other ones gave what I felt were smaller responses to the need to understand society and its transformations. And so history got me eventually. I found it more interesting. I found some interesting teachers. I started working on a thesis that at the time was a book-length thesis, which I did on US history, trade unions in US history. I got this degree in 77, and then I started doing odd jobs, military service, emergency teaching for a few years. Then I got a fellowship to go to the US and continue my study. And then eventually in 1984, I got into a PhD program, which started the sort of professionalization of my approach to history.
So you were not interested in European history specifically right away, this path later?
Not at the beginning, no. I was far more interested in US history, probably because at the time we were still perceiving European society as a mix of modern and traditional set of arrangements, and the US seemed to indicate the way to the future. So understanding how the US capitalist system, the US state and US society had transformed throughout the 20th century looked very much in our debates at the time as possibly indicating the way or indicating patterns that Europe could take. I got to European history a bit later during my PhD because I started working on the Marshall Plan and the ways in which the US projected their social and economic model on Western European societies. And there, of course, the issue was not so much what the US intended to project, but how the European perceived it, received it, reshaped it, transformed it into their own reconstruction and recovery programs. And so that got me into the European side of history and sort of transatlantic relations as the pivot in my scholarly focus.
Very interesting. I was taking a look at your CV in order to prepare myself. And there it says that you've been teaching all over the history spectrum, international history, economic history, Cold War history. How come does there so many different histories that you can all combine into one sort of study or one sort of career?
I think because you cannot really separate one from the other. Once I started to focus on the post-war reconstruction and the way in which European societies were remade, also through their relationship with the US and the US government aid plans, as well as proposals and patterns that they suggested to Europeans. The international dimension immediately became very central, but it was an international dimension that included issues of security, of ideology, of economics, of the understanding of social relations. I was working on labor unions, so labor relations, industrial relations were critical. And from then on, I think I maintained the curiosity for what at the time was called international political economy, which in many ways brings together these various threads that I had afterwards developed, sometimes separately, sometimes together, whether it's a history of the Cold War or history of international economy, or the way in which European integration brings some of these elements together into a reshaping of governance in Europe. But I frankly cannot see them as separate. Then, of course, a specific research thread, they need to be separate, but I tend to always put them in context with each other, never losing sight of the way in which these various levels of international interactions are actually very closely, inevitably connected.
Yeah, that was a really nice answer. Thank you, sir. And then I've been tipped off by one of my teachers that you actually worked really closely alongside with Alan Milward, who is also someone that we read extensively in European history, on the history of European integration. Why would you say is this something worth studying today?
You mean European integration or Alan Milward?
European integration, and I thought I would mention Alan Milward.
Yeah, no, that's true. No, certainly if you study the history of European integration, sooner or later you bump into Alan Milward, because that still remains one of the work that defined the field, even though the field has changed very much over the last decades. I think because in many ways, European integration and the European community and then the European Union sit exactly at the point of intersections of these fields that I'm interested in. Less so for security, of course, but very centrally and squarely for international economic relation, economic growth, the way in which economics is translated also in regulations or attempted regulations of social relations, rights, etc. And obviously because not only integration was very prominent in the mind of the people that presided over the post-war reconstruction of Europe, but it became increasingly so and very massively so over the last 2 or 3 decades, totally imbricated and interlocked with our lives, be they finance, economics, environment, rights, traveling, citizenship, pandemics, all that. It's almost unthinkable to study how our societies in Europe work today without considering European integration as an integral part of it.
When you say that European integration is crucial to understand the world and the Europe we live in now, your students at the EUI, which sort of career path do they take after they graduate with a doctoral or a master's degree in European history or European integration? Which sort of pathways do they take?
By and large, an academic path, most of them decide to do a PhD in history, but also those in the other department, be it political science or law, because they have a scholarly mentality and interest. And so I think academic jobs are their first priority for the vast majority of them. It might be slightly different for lawyers and economists that have a larger range of options in international institutions, be it the European Bank or whatever. But certainly for historians, it's by and large academic. And in fact, about 75% of those who take a doctorate at the UI end up in academic jobs. Many of them, of course, go through a long series of postdoc fellowship and temporary fellowship on specific research projects, but still they are in an academic environment and eventually become full-time academics and research historians. Then there is a slice of people that it's probably growing, even though I don't have very recent data about it. A slice of them who end up in those jobs that we label as public history. That is, working in museums, working in historical societies or associations here and there, or in institutions, sometimes digital, blogs and digital media that have an element of history dissemination. So if some of them end up there. And then there is a fair amount of cases, we're still talking about small minorities, that by acquiring strong analytical abilities, which is what you do when you do a PhD, particularly a PhD in history, but not only in history, then they get jobs that you wouldn't expect. Just to give an example, a graduate of ours got a job in the police department of a major city in Scandinavia, in the research department of the police, because they do analysis of crime, neighbor by neighbor type, et cetera, and she put her skill to work, and apparently she's quite happy with the job. Another couple of researchers that I recall ended up in the diplomatic service, diplomatic career, again because the PhD gave them a sort of grasp of current issue and a strong analytical ability. Another one who was not an economist, was a historian, worked on a history of relationship between the Portuguese Empire, Brazil, and India at the time of decolonization, eventually got a job as an analyst in an international bank in Lisbon.
Okay.
So there are possibilities, but I would say 75 to 80% pursue an academic career, and in most cases they succeed in it.
Okay, great. If you say they succeeded it, you mean they attain seats at universities, or
they eventually get a university job as historian, teachers of history, and researchers in history.
Okay. I think you already touched on it a little bit, saying that a lot of also, well, even if it's a tiny percentage, some people end up in banks or police departments through their analytical skills. Would you say that outside of academic writing and source analysis, through the study of European history, you gain a certain skill set which you might not expect?
Well, not specifically by studying European history rather than another type of history. I don't think that makes much of a difference, but certainly by doing a PhD in history, you acquire a set of skills that come handy. The first one is very practical, but also very crucial, that you learn how to organize systematically what during the PhD are your sources, your readings, your interviews, if you do interviews, your material. And since the materials you use for a PhD is enormous in quantity and very varied in quality and type, you acquire a very systematic approach to handling this material transforming it into an analytical grid, and then eventually transforming this analytical grid into your own reading interpretation of the history you're studying, and therefore developing a thread that can narrate this history. This is a skill that is vital for a historian, but I think is a set of skills that can apply in many other areas, because many other areas, especially if they concern some kind of research, of course, require these skills, but not only in terms of research. The second skill that you learn that is, again, critical to historian is that you learn to look at people's own motivations, to look under the skin. I mean, whatever type of history you do with human beings that are distant from you, sometimes very distant from you, geographically, in time, in social conditions, in culture. What you need to do if you want to write good history is to understand how their own mind worked, how they related to the facts around them, without superimposing on them our own current, present patterns, paths, ideas, frameworks. So you get a good sense, if you are a perceptive scholar and historians, you get a good ability to get into other people's skin. And second, to accept their motivation, which is probably the most difficult thing to do. I myself never worked on those people with whom you cannot possibly empathize. I never did research on, Nazi mass murderers, for instance. And I still don't know how my colleagues can manage that emotionally. I'm not sure that I could, but they do, and they do well. So I never went into these extreme cases, but in the more normal case of people that I studied, they were government officials, trade union representatives, etc., understanding what motivated them, what kind of fears, anxieties, goals, desire they had, which is not impossible even through the relatively arid documents you find in archives, especially government archives, but it's still possible to read between the lines and get a sense of these people, of their personality, of their personal, as I said, fears, desires, aims. I think understanding that and learning to assess them in their own terms, not in our own terms, that's the basic skill for a historian. And that's a skill that I think might come handy also in other areas of life, because it gives you a more nuanced and in a way more tolerant also ability to relate to other people, that it might be very handy in many workplaces and in many professions. And then there is a learning that comes from teaching. And many of the PhD students do some teaching already, or they will do it as soon as they get into postdoc position. And teaching is also a very important learning experience, because you learn how to balance the double necessity to at the same time challenge and understand each single student.
Yeah. Now
you realize this mix, how you push this person, but at the same time understand the difficulties, the problems, the sometimes lack of self-confidence, sometimes other problems that each one of us has. And getting the balance between this need to be at the same time pushy and lenient, understanding and challenging, again, is a skill that is at the same time a personal development, but also a skill that you eventually can apply in many other relationships on the workplace or elsewhere. I think these are probably the three main type of skill that by doing research in the in history and in the humanities in general, you acquire, and that can be very handy, I think.
Thank you.
And very positive also for you personally.
Yeah, that was actually very insightful. I haven't thought about the second skill you mentioned, that you really need to understand a person that is completely removed from you through time. But environment.
I mean, think if you I don't know, if you're studying colonial relationships in Brazil or in Africa, you have a very different set of people with different power relations, with different moral standing in our own view. But at the same time, you have to understand the motivation of each one of them if you want to write good history.
Yeah,
otherwise,
absolutely.
you write a morality tale, which is necessary, but is not good history.
Yeah, I can completely understand that. One or maybe two last questions, because I think we're running out of time. I was wondering, you said the fields of European history and European integration specifically, it's changed quite a lot over the years. Which sort of questions do you see reoccurring now? I was thinking maybe questions of diversity in history telling, or Eurocentrism, or which sort of questions does the modern European historian ask himself, herself, themselves at the moment?
I think we ask a question that is at the same time old and new, which is, I think, the peculiarity of European history. That is the mix, the constantly changing mix of conflict and cooperation that links Europeans, North and South, East and West, in an entity that is at the same time recognized and self-recognized as an entity, Europe. Particularly in its projections outward. Obviously, when we went into empire and colonialism, we identify ourselves and Europeans very easily, but at the same time fighting each other to death, both in the imperial enterprise, but also domestically, as we all know, from the war of religions to the two world wars. Conflict has been at the heart of the European experience, if you want to call it that, but at the same time also cooperation, interactions, migration. It's always been there. So in a way, European history is in that sense not different from what it used to be. It's still that problem. If you want to go more contemporary, I think the issue here is how these various levels, both of governance, from local regions to national governments, to the European Union, to international arrangements that are even broader, if not global, interact with each other and transform our daily lives and our perspectives for the future. And at the same time, how citizens of Europe, in its increasing set of diversity, operate and again cooperate and conflict with each other in a framework that is far more compact and unified than it used to be, but at the same time still remain in many ways fragmented, divided within non-nation states, languages, ethnicities, etc., etc. So I think this is the challenge. It's always been the challenge of European history, which was in a way disguised when history was very much national, and it was an apology of the nation and the nation state. But as soon as you go beyond that very narrow reading of history, it's fairly clear that European history is complex, and this complexity and multi-meaning, let's say, conflict, cooperation, etc., is a very, very interesting challenge to study and to understand. And that's why I think it's still pretty relevant and central for many of us. Yeah,
highly interesting. Thank you, sir. Maybe one last question. Mm-hmm. So all of these students, well, I assume most of these students here, they now have to decide between the different specializations. What skills or traits would you say are required to, maybe succeed in European history, and any other advice that you would like to hand on?
Well, the skills that I mentioned before, the skills that I think I acquired are still very relevant. understanding people in their own term, understanding their own motivations, etc. Organizing your work, that's crucial, because you are dealing, if you get into a PhD in history, you're dealing with an enormous mass of fragmented and diverse information, and the way you organize it and come to dominate it and understand it is the key element.
Yeah.
So systematic organization is crucial. I would say languages, because obviously if you really want to do European languages, you cannot rely on your own language plus maybe French or English or German, but you need a few. And that's personally my major regret, and I never went beyond Italian and English. I can read Spanish and French, but that's about as far as I go. But I think especially now that we have a larger understanding of Europe, which includes a lot of Central Eastern European countries, peoples, and languages, I think acquiring several languages, not necessarily a conversational level, but certainly a reading level is crucial. I would say getting into the so-called digital humanities is ever more relevant. If you look at advertisement for jobs, entry-level jobs in history or humanities, this is almost a requirement now. So getting not only, you know, the obvious good ability to use the basic ICT tools that we all use, but to get interested and curious on how digital technology can affect and change, and are affecting and changing the way we do history. I think that's certainly a crucial skill, and is going to be more and more crucial. And then there are a set of skills that are not really skills, that are personal qualities that one can though cultivate and improve. So if you want to do a PhD in history, I would say you need a lot of patience with yourself, especially. Not so much with other people, but to yourself, because it's a long slog, sometimes frustrating, very often solitary. So needs a good degree, not an exceptional degree, but a good degree of self-confidence, at the same time patient with yourself, ability to push yourself, but at the same time not pushing you too much, not being over eager to achieve things quickly, because that's not the way to do. And going back to the subject of your inquiry, of your research, of course, empathy with the people you study, also empathy with the people you study with, because, you know, in a doctoral program like ours, there is a very intense collective life, mutual criticism, mutual reading of draft papers, chapters, etc. So empathy with the human beings around you and the human beings that you study is also very, very important, I think.
Okay, thank you. I think this is a great closing to the interview. I will certainly take the empathy part into my thesis, which is on social purism in America, and it's very, very difficult sometimes. But yeah, thank you so much for your time and all your answers and your patience. I would say we could open the floor to some questions if the audience has questions. One from Dana. Where would you say you have obtained most of your skills during your academic life or during your career?
Where? Or when?
It says where, but I would say probably in which area of study, or maybe.
I think there are a lot of things that you keep learning throughout your entire life, maybe perfecting at a certain point. But certainly the first encounter that you typically do during your PhD with senior scholars that might be your supervisors or other teachers that you bump into, as well as slightly older, more experienced scholar, but still young enough that you sort of identify with them, those encounters are crucial, are absolutely crucial. And those are the encounters through which you not only learn the key ropes of the professions, but you also, by, you know, constantly comparing yourself to them, you also learn how to measure yourself and therefore measure your improvements and set your own goals. So I think those experiences in the first 5-10 years of probably any profession, but certainly scholarship in history is crucial. So for me, was my PhD, was my encounter with Millward and other senior scholars in the first years of my my research. But then skills and attitudes continue to get sort of improved and perfected over the years. You never reach a stage at which you say, okay, I know what it needs to be done, and from now on I'm a sort of automatic pilot. If you do that, you probably become a worse scholar and certainly a probably drier and more boring person, I would imagine.
Probably. Madeline is asking, what would you define as a scholarly mentality from your experience? So I guess she's asking if you want to take an academic path. So what is the mentality of an academic?
I think an inquiring one, you know, the mentality of somebody who thinks there are a lot of things to learn, and learning them and learning how to deal with them is not only useful, but also pleasant, is a nice way to live your life. And so the feeling of having an active mental life and to learn and continue to learn and continue at the same time to discuss this learning with other people, senior, junior, your teachers as well as your students. I think that's probably in a nutshell, the definition of a scholarly mentality, an inquiring mind.
Great answer. Laura asks, did you ever doubt your academic career choices? If so, what has helped you to go through these periods of doubt?
Yes, of course. Yeah, no, I certainly doubted it, as I think a lot of people do doubt it through the doctorate, and perhaps in the first couple of years after a doctorate, in which you face two sets of doubts. First, shall I make it? Will I make it? Will I make a PhD thesis that is interesting? Or will I get to the end of it? Sometimes people are overwhelmed with the amount of work they need to do for a PhD, and they feel insecure about it. So there is certainly an element there of testing yourself to come up with solutions to problems that sometimes can seem very big, if not overwhelming psychologically. There are moments like that, I would say, in the life of almost everybody who does a PhD. Also because, as I said, a PhD by definition is a relatively solitary endeavor. You do it with other people, you are in a dialogue with your teachers, but at the same time is you and your sources and your materials and your ideas. So there is that. Second, there is a more practical one that depends on different moments in times. Of course, there are easier moments, there are more difficult moments, depending on the labor market. But when you got a PhD, then you have to try and get a job. Not everybody get a job right away. Not everybody get an exciting job. Sometimes one has to settle for fellowship that are useful, but not terribly exciting. And then I think doubt set in. Could I've taken a better career? Should I go for money rather than my own intellectual curiosity and drive? Should I settle for something else? And there, what sustains you is either the confidence in your work and the ability to tighten your belt for a few years and continue and insist and eventually get a better job and get into the academic ladder, if there still is something like that. Or you might go, let's say, decide that is not worthwhile and you prefer to take a job in a corporation or a bank or whatever. Both things happen. But certainly there are doubts. And then, of course, there are doubts throughout one's career. Whenever you start to thinking about a book and then writing a book and then doing your research, you have lots of doubts. doubts in your approach, doubts in your methodologies. I think that doubts and self-doubting is part and parcel of a scholar's life. And one has to learn to manage these doubts and self-doubts, which have a positive side as well as a potentially negative one. Psychologically, potentially negative, but very positive because they also keep in check the trend or desire to feel that you dominate entirely your life. You never dominate your life entirely. And so a degree of doubts and self-doubt, I think, is always salutary and helpful.
At the very beginning, when we started talking, you said that you're almost at the end of your career. Would you say you've surpassed all the doubts, or do you still have them?
No, I think I surpassed most of the doubts simply because I got used to live with them. I have not surpassed them in the sense that I don't have them, but I have a much more relaxed attitude to them at this point. Even though when I start new specific research project or research patterns, or sometimes when I'm faced with a supervisee, a PhD student whose project is not so simple or not so easily framed, I have a lot of doubts on how to deal with this project and therefore also to a certain extent with this person. Mm-hmm. And then obviously, in my job, as in any other moment in life, you meet people, be there your colleagues or your students. Some of them you like, some of them you like less, a few of them you dislike. And you have to deal with all of them without being dismissive, rude, offensive, etc., especially if you have the responsibility to be one of their supervisor or something like that. And so they're, learning to at the same time live with doubts and control them and not to become victim of your own doubts is very, very important for yourself, but also for the other people that you deal with.
Yeah, certainly. Virgil asks, might be slightly off topic, but do you have any advice on writing a great thesis? Keeping in mind that a bachelor thesis is 9,000 words long and not a PhD project.
Oh, this thesis you're talking about.
Small
first and crucial thing is write it on a topic that you like, that you're interested in, that you follow your own personal curiosity. If you choose a topic for an opportunistic reasoning, this topic is trendy, this topic is like my teacher, etc., you make your life more difficult, obviously. So choose a topic that you like, in the sense that you are intellectually challenged, stimulated, interested in. Write clearly. There still is the tendency of thinking that if you write in a very complex and involuted way, you're writing something that is intellectually deeper, and that's not the case. I think writing clearly, writing as Italo Calvino said, lightness, clarity are the quality of a good writing. I think that applies to history as well. And write in a compact way. Don't overwrite, don't go beyond your limits, your assigned word limits. Almost anything can be written in 100,000 words, but also in 10,000 and possibly in 100. It depends how you shape your sentences and how you focus on what is central, what is crucial. So think carefully about what you want to communicate and shape your writing about it, around it.
Perfect, great advice. Joanna asks, how come a history scholar can eventually get into international banking?
Well, I'm wondering about it myself. I never worked in a bank. I have no idea why these banking people decided to hire this fellow. He's a very nice person, but that probably helps in interviews for jobs. I think probably they decided that doing the type of research you do for a PhD in whatever topic, you're doing a massive exercise in developing and sophisticated analytical skill, because that's what you do. And possibly some analytical skill are transferable elsewhere, even though the topic are very different, because you can do research, you can frame your own research, and you can extract from your research some conclusion results. Perhaps that applies to banking analysis, but I don't know. I've never been in a bank myself, except as a customer. So I'm just happy that it happened.
I mean, it's comforting to know that there are many different options.
Yeah.
Laura asks, would you advise students to study abroad or work abroad? Has working abroad given you new insights about how history is studied in other parts of the world? She's probably referring to your time in America as well.
Yes, by all means, absolutely, by all means. I think the almost self-evident truth that by meeting people that do not entirely share your language, your culture, or in the case of institutions like universities, the framework, the patterns that you're used to, you learn and you expand your angle of vision, if not your mind, is absolutely true. Of course, this doesn't mean one should travel for the sake of travel and zigzagging around all the time, but certainly this is also something we see statistically. When we do the selections for the incoming PhD students, and we select about 60 PhD students in history out of a pool of more or less 300 applicants that come from all over Europe, some also outside Europe, but most of them from European countries. We almost regularly do not see the prevalence of one single national university system. It's not that students who studied in Germany, let's say, are always better than students who studied in Greece. But almost always, I would say 95% of cases, people who studied in 2 or 3 different countries do better. People who did their undergraduate study, let's say, in the Netherlands, and then a master in France or in Britain or in Germany or in Switzerland, and vice versa, they tend to do better. I think because the simple fact of being exposed to different university systems, to different type of teaching, to different type of lectures, seminars, etc., to different demands and to different requirements, make for not only a richer, more diversified experience, but produce a more elastic and adaptable mentality and approach to your own studies, and also to your own personality, to your own self, because of course, many of those skills that we discussed throughout these conversations are better acquired if you have a variety of encounters outside your own comfort zone. So I would say yes, by all means. It doesn't necessarily mean that one has to go to the United States or to Japan or to Singapore, even though that might help depending on the field of studies, but doing work in different type of universities in different countries and different systems is definitely very, very, very helpful. And I would say rewarding on a personal level as well.
Okay, great. Are there any more questions? Otherwise, I would really like to thank you for your time. I thought it was a really great interview, especially as someone who's approaching the end of their bachelor and now needs to figure out what to do.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
No, thank you very much. And I hope to see some of you showing up as applicants for our PhDs at EUI.
Hopefully, one day.
Sometime. Anyway, thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, sir.
Sure. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.